20 years ago, almost to the day, I received the following letter. Dear Rabbi Kornberg, I was prepared to come early this evening and talk briefly with you. Actually, I was going to come to say goodbye. I awoke Tuesday morning early, a little before 6, went down the hall, turned on the news just like any other morning. You told me once that you did not know how or when things would fall into place for me. Would it occur slowly over time or in the form of a sudden epiphany or realization? I have the answer. It was both, and it was neither. After seeing the second plane crash into the World Trade Center, I walked outside and admitted in a sudden flood of clarity that I had no desire or notion to pray to God, to pray for those people who were dead or dying or trapped. Let me be clear, I do not make this decision because I'm angry with God. I make this decision because I've finally admitted to myself that whether he exists or not makes no difference to me. I realize just how arrogant and bold that statement may sound, but it's the conclusion that I've come to, and I stand by it. I'm perfectly comfortable with it, and if God wants to, he may damn me for it. It doesn't change a thing. Over the years, I have reread this letter many times. And what tears at me the most is that this letter was not yelling or crying or screaming at God. Rather, this very intelligent, passionate person had come to a point where they said, I give up. The trauma is just too much, and I am no longer willing to try and integrate it into my life, to try and make any sense of it. 20 years later, we still struggle with the effects of September 11th. We feel it as individuals, each in our own way. We feel it as a Jewish community, with budget decisions revolving around security and a required suspension of the fantasy that we're safe no matter what. We feel it as a country. Every time we fly, every time we gather, every time we watch the news and realize that the world has never been the same since that day. The trauma of 9/11 persists. It's a reality of life, trauma, and yet we seem to be woefully unequipped to deal with it. Tonight, I want to consider what our tradition has to teach us about coping with trauma and facing a world that seems to present it on multiple levels and at every turn. We will try to understand what it means to talk about individual and communal trauma, and hopefully to learn how we can grow from it and become even better people because of it. To begin, let's define what we mean by trauma. Ronnie Janoff Bullman, a professor of psychology at University of Massachusetts Amherst, wrote a book called Shattered Assumptions. In it, she defines trauma in the context of some basic assumptions not being met. According to her, we trust that there is justice in the world. We trust that there is order in the world and that it's not merely chaos. And finally, we believe that we ourselves are worthy, moral, and decent, and therefore deserving of good things in life. These ideas constitute our assumptive world. Now, all of these assumptions are found in various ways in Jewish tradition as well. Justice and order are a fundamental basis to any Jewish philosophy. The idea that we are of value, that we matter not only to ourselves, but that we can make a difference, that's the cornerstone of the idea of covenant. And yet, there have been so many times in our history that these basic principles have been shattered. In some ways, it's similar to the triumvirate that I teach in my basic Judaism class when talking about God. We believe that God is just, we believe that God is good, and we believe that God is all-knowing. And yet when we take a hard look at the world, we have a difficult time maintaining all three of these ideas simultaneously. And that moment of realization can lead to a religious crisis. In the same way, when the basic assumptions laid out by Janoff Bullman are broken, we encounter trauma. The newest aspect of the social scientific study of these ideas is that trauma can actually be passed through the generations, almost like a genetic trait. In a book I read this year by Resma Menachem called My Grandmother's Hands, he develops this theory, and he talks about it from the perspective of the African American community. He argues that contrary to what many people believe, trauma is not primarily an emotional response. Trauma always happens in the body. It's a spontaneous, protective mechanism used by the body to stop or thwart further or future potential damage. If it's indeed something that happens in the body, then it makes sense that it might be passed from one person to the next. Menachem's research shows that unhealed trauma acts like a rock thrown into a pond. It causes ripples that move outward, affecting many other bodies over time. After months or years, unhealed trauma can appear to become part of someone's personality. Over even longer periods of time, as it's passed on and gets compounded through other bodies in a household, it can become a family norm. And if it gets transmitted and compounded through multiple families and generations, it can start to look like a culture. We see this not only as a result of slavery and the racism that the African American population has experienced, as Menachem argues, but also in other vastly traumatic occurrences as well. In an article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science in 2018, they show the same idea by looking at children of Civil War POWs. It showed that severe hardship suffered by men as a prisoner of war led to high mortality among their sons born after the war. The trauma was passed on to children, even though they did not experience it themselves. Now that's something that we as Jews understand. How much of who we are is based on the communal trauma that has been passed on from one generation to the next. Each year, we still literally taste the bitterness of Egyptian slavery nearly 3 millennia later. The reason given in the Ten Commandments for the observance of Shabbat is, remember you were a slave in Egypt. The story of the Exodus and the trauma we faced as a people both before and after in the wilderness has shaped us spiritually and ethically. The more we think about it, the more we realize that our history is filled with moments of great trauma. Take the temple in Jerusalem. What other group alive today has gone through the destruction of their ethno-religious center twice and still survives as a living and vibrant culture? What other group has been so targeted with religious hatred throughout the centuries? Blood libels, inquisitions, pogroms. Sure, there are others who have suffered ethnic cleansing throughout human history, but the Shoah is unique in its scope and reach throughout the world. There is no doubt that we are indelibly changed and transformed as a people because of the historical traumas that we've suffered. And there's no doubt that the effects of those events are still with us even today, so many generations later. But sometimes, when a group deals with their own traumas, they forget that they're not the only people who've suffered. That brings me back to Resma Menachem's book. In My Grandmother's Hands, he describes these same ideas through the lens of his community. It's a difficult and challenging book to read. All of my studies and my trips to Yad Vashem and even my stories from my own grandfather have helped me become a bit numb to hearing the trials and tribulations of Jews throughout history. But to hear it from the perspective of another people was eye-opening and heart-wrenching. I learned that in many ways, our communities have very different experiences from one another, living here in the United States as minorities. But I also learned that there are some things that we share. I learned that we must ask ourselves the question that Menachem challenges us with. If we don't address our ancient historical trauma, what will be passed down to our children, to their children and grandchildren? So we've come to terms with the fact that life is filled with trauma, that we're shaped by it, and it's passed from one generation to the next. What do we do with that? How do we rise above the deleterious effects that trauma induces and transform it into something that actually makes us better? Viktor Frankel, the renowned Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, is quoted as saying, between a stimulus and a response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lays our growth and our freedom. In light of our current conversation, I will reword this to say that there is space for us to choose how we will respond to traumatic moments in our lives and those historical traumas that we inherit. Many of us are aware of the term PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Even if we don't fully comprehend it, we understand that in these cases, the trauma is debilitating and affects a person's ability to engage in the world in a healthy and productive way. But there's another PT abbreviation that many of us are much less familiar with. PTG, post-traumatic growth. There's a group out of the University of North Carolina that's been studying this for decades now, and they argue that PTG is positive change experienced as a result of a struggle with a major life crisis or traumatic event. We've all met people who, in spite of tragedy and challenge, seem to grow into stronger, more inspirational people. One example of this type of person can be found in a 2010 TED Talk. Her name is Stacy Kramer, and she shares the following story. Imagine, if you will, a gift. I'd like for you to picture it in your mind. It's going to do incredible things for you. It will bring all of your family together. You will feel loved and appreciated like never before. It will recalibrate what's most important in your life. It will redefine your sense of spirituality and faith. You'll expand your vocabulary, meet new people, and you'll have a healthier lifestyle. Your life will have new meaning. The price? $55,000, and that's an incredible deal. By now, I know you're dying to know what it is and where you can get one. Does Amazon carry it? Does it have the Apple logo on it? Not likely. It was a rare gem, a brain tumor, hemangioblastoma, the gift that keeps on giving. She concludes her TED Talk by saying, "I wouldn't wish this gift for anyone, but I wouldn't change my experience. It profoundly altered my life. So the next time you're faced with something that is unexpected, unwanted, and uncertain, consider that it just may be a gift." Many of us in the San Diego Jewish community are still mourning the loss of another such person. Michael Jesser, the former CEO of our Jewish Federation, chose to show us all how to grow from the hardships in our lives and use them to make the world around us better. He was able to take what would have been unbearable trauma for most of us and turn it into something that will never cease to inspire those who know him. He chose how he would respond to the trauma in his life. I would like for us to consider that seeing the world in this way is actually not only a powerful and healthy way to do so, but it's also a fundamentally Jewish way to do so. And the reason we're here together tonight. Over the next 25 hours, we are commanded, "V'initem et nafshotechem," you shall afflict yourselves. In essence, we're being told to induce trauma on ourselves. Not because we're evil or deserving of punishment, but because by doing so, we can grow into better people. Our tradition works tirelessly to transform moments. Sometimes we change mundane moments into holy ones, and other times we transform challenge and upheaval into growth and learning. Some of the most powerful rituals that we have are aimed at this very thing. And that is the first of three ways that we as Jews deal with trauma. We wrap it in ritual, not to hide from it, but rather to give ourselves time and space to manage it. Take a time of deepest personal trauma for most of us, the death of a loved one. Our tradition brings us the rituals of Shiva to manage the overwhelming emotions. In an article called "Order Amidst Chaos: How Judaism and Psychology Respond to Trauma," we read, "Jews have a long history of trauma, and Judaism's traditional responses and rituals can be surprisingly modern. Sitting Shiva, mourning with a community, is one of the ways that we confront pain and then move forward. Ritual gives us a framework through which we can deal with those things that are nearly impossible to handle alone." The second way that Jews deal with trauma is to work to mitigate it while acknowledging that it is still there. Tomorrow morning, our Chazan will sing the prayer Unatana Tokef. And in it, we come face to face with the trauma of the realization of our fallibility and our mortality. What is the response to the paragraph listing one after another type of death that we humans can face? Repentance, prayer, and tzedakah overturn the severity of the decree. I've taught many times in the past that the statement does not say it overturns the decree itself, but rather these are ways to mitigate its effect. The trauma remains, but we have found specific and targeted ways as Jews to cope with it and perhaps even grow from it. The third way Jews work through trauma, both personal and communal, is ultimately what I've dedicated my life to. We have already spoken about Egypt and the power of the Seder to turn trauma into teaching. In other words, when we face trauma, we name it, we reshape it, we repurpose it, and we learn from it. This is not unique to us as Jews, but it's fundamental to who we are and our worldview. Our love of learning opens an avenue for us to cope with obstacles that life brings us. The way I understand it, the more we learn, the more we're able to counter the cross-generational impact of trauma, because learning, too, is passed from one generation to the next. We, at Congregation Beth Am, have spent a great deal of thought and energy in leaning into learning as a primary antidote to this generational trauma. The Torah that you saw earlier today and that we will read from tomorrow, our Nidrei Holocaust Torah, is the perfect example of this. It's not only a symbol of our community, but part of the story that we have now made our own. Every time we read from it, every time a bar or bat mitzvah student learns about it, we acknowledge the trauma and write a new chapter of the story. Adding a new chapter is also the reason why this community will be doing something quite extraordinary. As I spoke about on Rosh Hashanah, this year is the 40th anniversary of the establishment of our Beth Am community. But 1 year later, in 1983, that's when we received our Holocaust Torah. The first week of May 2023, for its 40th year, we will be taking our Torah back to Nidrei for a visit, not permanently. As a community, we will read from it there for the first time since the end of the trauma that destroyed the Jewish community in that part of the world. And in the face of that catastrophe, we will celebrate the vibrancy and life that is found in our Beth Am community. This is an opportunity you will not want to miss, especially since it also happens to be Israel's 75th year, and after our time in Nidrei, we'll be taking the Torah with us and joining the Jewish Federation mission that will be happening, going to Israel as well. More information will be coming your way in the next few months, but I encourage you not to miss this once-in-a-lifetime trip and join us as we reshape the story of trauma into one of life and joy through our actions. My friends, trauma is an unavoidable part of life. Each one of us has experienced it in our own unique way. We have shared difficult moments together as a community. Certainly, these last 2 years has brought its challenges and will leave a lasting impact on many of us as we try to understand and cope with the trauma that COVID brought us. But one of the things that I've learned from looking back at 9/11 is that healing and hope for the future are often found in the actions of people. It was seen in those people who risked their lives to save others, firefighters, police, EMTs, doctors, nurses, volunteers of all type, both then and now. Healing on 9/11 is found in the actions of the men and women aboard those planes or in the towers who made a call from their cell phones to speak to their family, to make sure that even in those horrific moments, the things that needed to be said were said. Healing is found in the synagogues and churches and mosques and parks and auditoriums and every other place where people all over the world came together to say, this will not be tolerated. We need to be better. September 11th was one of those difficult gifts because it gave us September 12th, when we saw a glimpse of what we could be together, although we have seemed to have forgotten it. May this Yom Kippur remind us that through the inevitable hardships that the traumas of life will bring, we have the power and the tools of our tradition to face them and to live with them. As we feel the self-induced pain of the fast over the next hours, may it open our hearts to growth and learning. May we come to understand that The inheritance of our history, while difficult, brings us context and meaning and allows us to better understand the world around us and those who live in it. Gmar Chatima Tova.